That's why he's like,
Joe, both of them?
yeah.
Okay, and tell people when they facilitate if we need to move the cameras or not.
Hi, everybody. I'm passing out copies of an issue of our quarterly magazine, Poultry Press, United Poultry Concerns, because among other interesting and important things in this magazine is an essay that I wrote on the difference between negativity and pessimism in animal rights. And I think it's important to be aware that there is a distinction to be made and that it really does have a great deal to do with the activism that we do. So I'll just, you already got this, right? Okay, sure, that would be great, thank you. Do visit our table out there. We have all kinds of literature for you to take, and a few books are still left to buy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Padilla. I'm Colombian. I am the speaker for Animal Naturalis Internacional. This is an organization for the animal defense that works in Spain and international business. So my language is Spanish, so I apologize for my English in advance. I will do my best. Thank you for accepting me to this conference. And please excuse myself because I'm not going to be able for the whole session. I have to pick my bus at 6:30. So there's my email address. If you have any questions, comments, or appreciations on the topic, I will be more than grateful for your feedback. about the judicial turn of the social movement for animal rights, which has brought the debate on animal rights to Colombian high courts. Second, I will comment on two judgments about bullfighting and animal testing produced in response to the judicial turn of the social movement, as well as the constitutional juridical change on the legal status of animals in Colombia expressed in these high court's decisions. And finally, I will conclude with how the performance of high courts have impacted the dynamics of the social movement and the public debate on animal rights in Colombia. Let me begin by explaining that when I say high courts, I am referring to the Constitutional Court and the Council of the State. They both make part of the judicial branch. The first, the Constitutional Court, decides on constitutionality of laws, and the second, the Council of the State, decides on conflicts between citizens and government agencies. The decisions taken by both establish legal precedents. So, first, the judicial turn of the social movement for animal rights. In Colombia, like in other countries, the debate about the treatment of animals has become a high ethical and political debate that calls for politicians, media, and public opinion, mainly because of activities such as bullfighting, which cultural character is being called into question. In this process, the social movement for animal rights is becoming aware of their role as a collective political actor and its proposal of cultural transformation. In addition, it has begun to clear its affinity with the arguments of other social movements that demand the recognition of rights. For instance, the LGBT, which is the lesbian gay. As a result, the social movement for animal defense has shifted its speech and strategy from demanding of protection to claim of rights, and from administrative and political forum to judicial forum by means of class actions and actions of unconstitutionality. It is important to understand that before 2010, high courts had had some judgments related to the coexistence with animals, but not with animal rights. This is the first time. Now, what is the social movement looking for by means of this judicial turn? It is seeking not just for material effects, meaning changes in the rules that govern the treatment and protection of animals, but also for symbolic effects, which include, first, we want to refine the public debate on animal rights and the doctrine of fundamental rights grounded on the anthropocentric humanism. Second, question previous consensus, especially in civil law, in which animals are considered things or goods that can be owned. Third, involve academic opinions in the public debate from the point of view of rights and animal sentience. Fourth, harmonize animal rights arguments with other social movements which are looking for emancipation. And fifth, challenge high courts, especially the Constitutional Court, which has been recognized as one of the most progressive courts in Latin America. Now I will discuss how high courts have responded to this judicial turn and to new mentalities and cultural sensitivity about our relationship with animals. With this in mind, I'm going to comment on two judgments that represent a juridical change on the legal status of animals in Colombia. Later on, we will see how this change has been weak and malleable. The first judgment, in 2010, the Constitutional Court decided a claim of unconstitutionality against the national law for animal protection because this law considers bullfighting and other cruel animal shows as legal. In its judgment, the court raised the conflict between the state's duty to protect animals and yet, on the other hand, bullfighting practice in 4 ways. First, limiting the municipalities and dates where it can be made. Second, prohibiting the investment of public resources in its realization. Third, requiring organizers to take measures to eliminate or reduce the animal suffering. And fourth, and probably the most controversial condition, empowering local mayors to allow or disallow the show according to these conditions at home. The second judgment was decided in 2012 by the Council of the State. In this case, the High Court resolved a class action brought by a non-government organization against the foundation of the powerful Colombian scientist Manuel Pacarroyo because of testing on monkeys from Peru, Colombia, and Brazil for the production of a vaccine against malaria. Plaintiffs alleged first a violation of the collective right to a healthy environment because of wildlife trade. Second, a breach of ethical protocols involving animals. And third, animal abuse. The decision of the Council of the State was to cancel the permission to test on monkeys temporarily because the environment was being damaged and monkeys were being captured and used illegally. In other words, because Mr. Pacarroyo was proceeding illegally, not because of animal rights. The decisions made by both high courts produced a juridical change reflected in arguments such as, first, animals are sentient beings. This means they can feel pain and suffering. Therefore, it should change their legal status from things to sentient beings. And second, it is urgent to overcome the anthropocentric vision of rights to ensure effective protection for animals. High courts even appealed to the concept of speciesism to equate in its arguments the discrimination of animals with other forms of discrimination which are not accepted even by our best moral theories. But despite this rhetorical pomposity, both courts in their decisions were not beyond stating that animals only have a right to humane treatment. It is in this sense that I talk about a weak juridical change. Even though high courts incorporated in the ethics of animal rights into Colombian jurisprudence, they were not beyond welfarism, humanitarian treatment, to confirm that animals can be used in shows and experimentation, but their treatment cannot be cruel. From this standpoint, cruelty against animals affects human dignity, not there is an animal dignity in itself. What happened after these two judgments? In Bogota, the mayor decided to suspend bullfighting shows because Bogota, this is a very progressive mayor, because bullfighting entrepreneurs were unwilling to meet the condition to eliminate or reduce the animal suffering. As a result, in 2013, bullfighting entrepreneurs challenged the judgment of Constitutional Court. The new decision of Constitutional Court was to order the return of bullfighting to Bogota, suspending the mayor's right to disallow the show, and stating that elimination of animal suffering can be done in the future. With respect to the judgment of animal testing, Mr. Pacarroyo challenged the court decision as well, and the Council of the State decided to overturn this decision because it considered that suspending the permission to perform testing meant a delay in medical research which adversely wouldn't be in the best interest of human beings. I have to clarify that these new decisions were taken same high courts, but by different judges. Each one of the courts have 5 courtrooms. So it is in this sense that I talk about a malleable juridical change. On one hand, high courts added a new meaning to the judgments, a new meaning contrary to the animal interest of courts, and in the other hand, they were influenced by political and economical sectors interested in changing these decisions. So at the moment, there are 2 judgments for each one of these issues, both binding and animal cases. The first judgments allow and limit practices at the same time, introducing a new status of animals in the legal organization. The second judgment practically reverse the limits or conditions introduced by the first judgment, but they keep the juridical rhetoric about animals as sentient beings. In concrete, the exploitation of animals has not changed. Finally, how has the performance of high courts affected the social movement and the public debate about animal rights? The social movement, media, and the public opinion received the high court's decisions as a partial and confusing message in contrast with its possibility and power to make real innovation of jurisprudence. However, the performance of high courts in these judgments produced significant effects. The first, debate gained visibility and reputation as a progressive issue that defies social consensus about our relationships with animals and violence. Second, the legal vanguard of the high courts was strongly criticized for not taking advantage of these opportunities to bring about a cultural transformation that is being demanded by a growing sector of the colonial society. Third, political analysts and academic bodies became involved in the debate, providing novel legal and political arguments, as well as comparing the claim for animal rights to other social movements which demands emancipation and equality. Fourth, debates in media increased, and as a result, people have characterized the conflict as a struggle between those who defend non-violence principles and those who defend the private interests of an economical and political sector of society. This, of course, has favored the social movement and animal rights. And fifth, animal protection improved its standing in the national political agenda, in Congress and local government. With regard to social movement, this process has had 2 main effects. First, the movement has become more consolidated and has refined its legislative, administrative, and judicial activism, aiming for new rules and public policy changes. Second, and probably the most challenging at the moment, the social movement is considering a popular local consultation. In Bogota, which is the Colombia's capital city, the popular local consultation is a mechanism for citizen participation similar to the referendum, by means of which Bogota's bullfighting ring should continue to be used for bullfighting shows or not, because Bogota's bullfighting ring is a public building. So this is the process that we are working on currently, and which we certainly would ask for your support later on in the future. When the process begins, we are probably to need we are going to need signatures and video message supporting the course. So thanks a lot for your attention and
pretty sure that this is an issue for the other two members of the panel, right? That you're gonna go. Oh no, she's gonna. That maybe I can take questions now. Yeah, you can take questions now for Andrea. Okay. Yeah. So, does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yes, thank you.
Please, in a high, strong and slow.
Strong and slow.
Yeah.
Okay. English is not my first language either, so I will speak slowly.
Okay.
I was actually quite surprised when you said that challenging bullfighting in court actually resulted in public consciousness about animal rights and seeing this in a sympathetic way as a progressive cause. I expected that it would not be the case. It would have challenged. It would have been seen as a more in a negative way in the media. Can you explain or expand on the way in which it was positively viewed in the media?
Yeah, right. Yeah, because bullfighting has divided the Colombian society. One part of the society, the fund, it's involved in the discourse about animal rights. People and the other part of the society is defending private interest. Yeah, it's an economical interest, and so media has taken part in the debate, and yeah, media is presenting the debate as a issue for rights, as a progressive issue. Yeah, for rights. Yeah, sorry.
Have there been any projections about what would happen if this referendum took place?
Yeah. We are very optimistic. It's a process very expensive for but this is the cost of the democracy. We are planning major referendum or the popular consultation for next year with the new mayor. Yeah, Bogota society, the people of the capital city, is waiting this process. People is demanding this process because people we don't believe in some institutions like constitutional court, politicians. So people is demanding popular participation in this kind of topics.
Questions?
Can you compare maybe briefly the fight against bullfight in Colombia and Spain? I mean, are they similar somehow? Because I know in Spain, in some cities, they excluded it now, such as Barcelona. But again, that's a place where bullfighting is major still. And the lobby, especially the Northern European lobby that finances bullfighting in Spain, keeps feeding it. What's it? Can you make a comparison? What's happening in Colombia?
Actually, for us, that has been very useful. Use the discourse against colonization because the people who defend bullfighting in Bogota is a very powerful sector of the society, and they want to seem like Spanish people. So we are fighting against this kind of discourse, like colonization. Yeah? So people is feeling bullfighting like a kind of domination from Europe. So this has been useful, and the last survey in Colombia has demonstrated that just 5% of Colombian society agree with bullfighting.
Can I ask them again? Are you working on any other issue? Like, first, why did you select the bullfighting, and are you working on other sectors?
Yeah, we are working on different sectors, but bullfighting has been a very interesting sector for establish the discourse about animal rights, because we can demonstrate the two positions in the debate, and because we can demonstrate that people which are in favor of bullfighting, it's a kind of politician that it's not loved in Colombia. Yeah, so we are working on other topics, but bullfighting has been very useful and interesting for us to establish the discourse as an interesting, as a powerful discourse for animal rights.
Any other questions?
We have to run to the legislation. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Loretta Steck. She's professor of English at San Francisco State University, where she teaches 21st century literature and English, with specializations in modernists, women writers, and South African authors. Recently, she has begun teaching students in interdisciplinary analytics and literature. The title of her talk is Confluence of East and West, Mohandas Gandhi and Henry Stevens' Assault on Kinship Across Ages.
Thanks to all of you who are still here at the end of a long day. So I will try to be perky. This is a more historical talk than the talks I've heard today. So a little bit back in time. I'm going to talk to you about the story of Mohandas Gandhi's involvement in the vegetarian movement in London between 1888 and 1891, including his crossing paths with Henry Stevens Salt. This meeting and this kind of back and forth between these figures and in this circle has become a kind of touchstone in understanding how Gandhi's anti-colonial politics evolved. And the story goes something like this. These are some quotations from Gandhi's autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth. Gandhi had arrived in London having made a vow to his mother not to touch wine, woman, or meat on his journey to Europe. He says that he practically had to starve for a number of weeks when he arrived in London, subsisting on spinach, bread, oatmeal, and jam. Eventually, he learned that London had numerous vegetarian restaurants. According to one historian, there were approximately 34 in 1889. And he discovered one in Farringdon Street. And this is a longish quotation from the autobiography. Gandhi says, "The sight of this restaurant filled me with the same joy that a child feels on getting a thing after its own heart. Before I entered, I noticed books for sale exhibited under a glass window near the door. I saw among them Henry Salt's plea for vegetarianism. This I purchased for a shilling and went straight to the dining room. This was my first hearty meal since I arrived in England. I read Salt's book from cover to cover and was very much impressed by it. From the date of reading this book, I may claim to have become a vegetarian by choice. I bless the day on which I had taken the vow before my mother. I had all along abstained from meat in the interest of truth and of the vow I had taken, but had wished at the same time that every Indian should be a meat eater, and had looked forward to being one myself freely and openly one day, and to enlisting others in the cause. The choice was now made in favor of vegetarianism, the spread of which henceforth became my mission. strange and curious recollection, isn't it? Somehow Gandhi felt that he needed this volitional reinforcement of his vow to his mother via a Western author. And it's more curious still that Gandhi had looked forward to becoming an unabashed meat eater, even as he kept his vow to his mother while in Europe. And this motivation to become an unrepentant meat eater has to do with colonial politics and stereotypes of the Asian male body. And this came up in a panel earlier this afternoon, which I may or may not say more about. The author I've read who's described this tremendously well is Parma Roy, who has a study called Elementary Tracts, Appetites, Aversions, and the Post-Colonial. She explains this very well. Gandhi talks about how when he was in high school, a friend of his tempted him to eat meat with the following argument. The friend said, "We are a weak people because we do not eat meat. The English are able to rule over us because they are meat eaters." Gandhi says that when he was young, he began to believe that if the whole country took to meat eating, the English could be overcome, and therefore he experimented with meat. And again, this is a little bit long, but I'll shorten this quotation. He goes with his friend to a riverside, and the friend presents him with some goat meat. And he says, "The goat meat was tough as leather. I could not eat it. I was sick and had to leave off eating. I had a very bad night afterwards. A horrible nightmare haunted me. Every time I dropped off to sleep, it would seem as though a live goat were bleeding inside of me. I would jump up full of remorse. But then I would remind myself that meat eating was a duty, and so I became more cheerful." In this somewhat powerful recollection, the Gandhi who has become a vegetarian by choice remembers vividly the goat bleeding inside of him in this first instance of eating meat, revealing a kind of moment of terror of the merging of the human and the animal due to an act of, in this tradition, himsa, or violence that was prescribed by his family and his religion. Because Gandhi explains that he grew up in Gujarat, a part in India where opposition to and abhorrence of meat eating among the Jains and his community of Hindus were very strong and were to be seen nowhere else in India or outside in such strength. So I think most of us are familiar with the fact that Gandhi's nonviolence philosophy turns on this notion of himsa and ahimsa. Ahimsa usually is translated as nonviolence. And so I'd like to just think back a little bit. This notion of ahimsa is connected to the ancient doctrine that an animal values its life just as humans value theirs. And so destroying it manifestly against its will constitutes an act of violent injury. And there's a wonderful book, I really think it's a very well done scholarly study of the history of vegetarianism called The Bloodless Revolution. You may know it. And this scholar, Tristram Stewart, goes through and talks about the connections between Europe and the Indian subcontinent and the way that philosophies of animals kind of went back and forth over the centuries. So he starts with the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, and then moves on to Alexander the Great, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama, and many other travelers to India who brought back notions of animals and connections between animals and humans that were very different than the notions in Europe at the time. And Stewart says the following. He says, "Europeans became fixated with the belief underlying the Indians' vegetarianism, and nearly every traveler marveled at it, revealing in their responses their own prejudices and preoccupations. What was the proper relation between man and beast? What diet was suitable for the human body? What happened to people's temperament when they no longer committed daily violence to animals? Whatever the answers to these questions, one thing was certain. Encountering Indian vegetarianism triggered a review of European morality." So there were many people thinking through these questions before there was an active animal rights philosophy or political campaign in Europe. And even some Christians were swayed by these Indian notions or these notions from the subcontinent, and they began to see that even though they didn't want to convert to Hinduism, that there were certain principles that could be interpreted as an extension of their compassionate Christian philosophy rather than a kind of negation of the other tradition. So when Gandhi entered the world of vegetarians in London, which he did thoroughly, he became an active member of the Vegetarian Society. He wrote articles for their journal. He started a vegetarian club in the neighborhood of Bayswater. He was entering a philosophical and a social space that had been influenced by both Eastern, Hindu and Jain, and compassionate Christian ideologies. Now, one of the figures that was central to this movement at this time was Henry Stephen Salt, and he had a role in articulating at this historical moment a kinship among species. I don't know, some of you probably know about Salt's work, some of you may not. Salt helped to found the Humanitarian League, which was an organization that didn't only work on animal rights, it worked on a number of different issues in London at the time. But animal issues related to animal rights and welfare were part of their mission. And Salt titles his autobiography 70 Years Among Savages, which is a kind of quasi-anthropological title, but he's talking about his British compatriots. They're the savages. It's kind of clever. He says that the promoters of the Humanitarian League saw clearly that barbarous practices can be philosophically condemned on no other ground than that of the broad democratic sentiment of universal sympathy. Against this, he really kind of conflates a lot of these social justice activities at the time and agendas. He says that it's going to be very difficult to continue to do injustice, cruelty and injustice to animals if humans can be freed from cruelty and injustice, right? So he really links these different agendas and movements. So part of what's happening, I think, here at the end of the 19th century is a reaction to Darwinism. And so when he talks about the kinship between humans and other animals, he's really calling upon this Darwinian discourse that is being felt very strongly in this period. He also, though, sometimes sounds almost like a Jain, almost like a Hindu, when he says things like the following. By humanitarian, we mean one who feels and acts humanely, not toward mankind only, but towards all sentient life. Right? Pretty broad agenda there. Salt went on to write in 1892 the volume Animals' Rights considered a number of the points discussed in contemporary debates. He has chapters about whether animals have rights or not, the slaughter of animals for food, the sport of hunting, or as he terms it, amateur butchery, the fur and feather traffic, and vivisection and experimental torture. And Salt kind of sums up his own belief system by calling it the creed of kinship. And he says that he has a belief that in years to come there will be a recognition of brotherhood between man and man, nation and nation, human and subhuman, which will transform a state of savagery into one of civilization. Salt then had been indirectly influenced by a long tradition of Hindu and Jain thinking that had been brought to Europe over the centuries. He had also been influenced by other philosophical trends such as the anarchism of Peter Kropotkin, the writings of Tolstoy, and other thinkers in developing his creed of kinship. Gandhi then claims he was influenced by Salt's defense of vegetarianism in his small volume. to support the principles that his family subscribed to. Gandhi then went on, as we all know, to make the concept of ahimsa central to his anti-colonial politics. So there's a really wonderful book by a scholar named Leela Gandhi, who is, in fact, Mahatma Gandhi's granddaughter, or whatever that's worth, called Effective Communities. And she talks about how important this vegetarian circle and this humanitarian circle and their overlap was for a developing anti-colonial politics at the end of the 19th century. And she says the following. She says, the fin de siècle movement on behalf of animals demonstrates a deep discursive claim upon that association of unharmfulness and anti-colonialism, compassion and anti-imperialism, fundamental to the rudimentary grammar of Gandhian ahimsa. And Salt continued his work in different progressive causes until his death in 1939. As we all know, Gandhi lived a decade beyond Salt until he was assassinated right after World War II. And I guess what I really want to get to here is that I'm fascinated by this kind of global transcultural set of circuits of compassion across species, but I'm also really aware that this language from over a century ago has such a lot of what Leela Gandhi calls anthropocentric condescension in it, right? And I guess what I'd like to do kind of in the end of the paper here is just switch that term anthropocentric condescension to anthropocentric terror. I've heard a lot of anti-Donna Haraway comments today, and I kind of understand some of where that's coming from. I also think some of what Donna Haraway outlines can be really helpful, so I will invoke her here, because I do think she's very helpful in the way that she summarizes what she calls the three great historical wounds to the primary narcissism of the self-centered human subject, who tries to keep panic at bay by the fantasy of human exceptionalism. And these three wounds are the Copernican wound that removes the earth from the center of the cosmos, the universe, the Darwinian, which puts humans into the family of all other animals, and the Freudian, which posits an unconscious that undid the primacy of conscious processes, including the reason that comforted man with his unique excellence. And again, I think at the end of the 19th century, these thinkers were reacting to the Darwinian and certainly the Freudian. Let's think back to that incident in Gandhi's autobiography. He eats the little bit of goat and goes home and has that nightmare that the goat is bleeding inside of him, right? And I think that bespeaks the terror of the merging of himself with the goat, right? So even while Gandhi winds up being a very progressive thinker in many ways, there is still this kind of incipient terror in this story that he tells about his young self. And the fact that he feels better when he tells himself, oh, that's right, I'm supposed to eat meat because it's going to make me stronger and therefore be a better anti-colonial person or thinker. I think that just kind of illustrates the perverse logic of reason, right? That he can kind of reason away this terror, this nightmare, even though it is speaking a real truth in his unconscious. Salt has a similar moment, a little bit different, but analogous in certain ways, when he's talking about the British upper class and their craze for big game hunting. He says, tiger shooting is doubtless an exciting pastime, but what of that other tiger that lurks in the heart of each of us? How is he going to be eliminated so long as a savage lust for killing is a recognized form of amusement? So while Gandhi has this bleeding goat in his stomach, Salt posits a metaphorical tiger in his heart and in So I think we see a very important moment of terror there as well. So what do we take away from these stories in terms of what this conference is about and the kinds of more political papers I've been hearing today? Well, I'm sure that you'll help me think about that, so I'll just kind of say a couple thoughts that came to mind. I think that it's really important for all of us to keep our eye on colonialism and the intersections between colonialism and animal exploitation under conditions of neoliberalism. And I was only able to hear part of Bas Stanescu's talk, but I think that what I heard him say was very relevant here, right? That meat industry folks and all kinds of other entities are looking for new markets, looking for new consumers, trying to create this new world of meat exploitation out there that is overlapping with a certain colonial mindset. I am also thrilled to have heard Anita's paper about what's happening in Brazil, Ping Tsu's paper that was a bit about Taiwan as well as the United States, and Andrea's paper about Colombia, because I think that this history of thought moving back and forth from India to Europe shows us how vital cross-continental and transcontinental connections can be. And I know that there are Institute for Critical Studies conferences on other continents. And I don't know, I'm new to this organization, so I don't really know how much overlap there is and how many people are talking to each other, but I think that would be just wonderful, and I'm so happy to have heard those papers. And then, in terms of the terror, I'm wondering if it would be possible for us at some point to try to get over the notion that we need to heal anthropocentric wounds, and in some way work to kind of nurture them. That in other words, having these wounds is something that we can move with or leverage or use in some way to connect us to other suffering beings. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Thank you so much.
Our final speaker is Karen Davis, and she's the president of the United Poultry Concerns. She's the founder as well. The United Poultry Concerns Group is a nonprofit that promotes compassionate and respectful treatment of domestic fowl, including a sanctuary for the chickens in Virginia. So Karen is the author of Prison Chickens, Poisoned Eggs, an inside look at the modern poultry industry. A book called More Than Myth.
Yes.
The Turkey in History, Myth, Ritual, and Reality. And the Holocaust, continuous tale. A case for comparing atrocities. Her essay, Rescuing Solutions to Animal Welfare Problems, appears in Criterion Liberation. The paper she'll be giving today is entitled Single Issue Campaigns and Abolition Being Advocacy. Is there a conflict?
Are you able to put that picture up there?
Sure.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to see people here at this late time of day, and I hope everybody's still feeling intellectually alive and eager to ask questions and listen and talk and everything else. Yeah, there I am. I'm not going to do a PowerPoint. I just wanted to show you a picture of me with one of our sanctuary chickens who she no longer is alive, but her name was Ringlet, and she was rescued. And this picture appeared in the Washington Post about 10 years ago, and I've always loved it. And once an animal activist, a man, berated me for kissing a chicken in public and saying, you're going to make everybody think we're a bunch of wackos by kissing a chicken, in public. So you're not supposed to love chickens, you're supposed to respect them or something like that. So anyway, I love chickens, and I do respect them, and I don't feel that we should ever feel that we need to apologize for anything that we do for animals, and certainly not for loving them, if we do, and certainly we must respect them, and the two are not mutually exclusive, but they should be part of the feelings that we have and the drive that we have on behalf of animal rights and on behalf of animals. So, as announced, I am going to talk about an issue that has become an issue in the animal advocacy movement, in the animal advocacy community, which is the justification or lack thereof of single issue campaigns. How many in the audience are aware that the question of single issue campaigns has become a somewhat raging controversy within the animal advocacy movement? So most of you are aware. And I assume that most of you are aware that Gary Francione in particular has denounced what he calls single issue campaigns. And he has picked on me and United Poultry Concerns in some of his outpourings on Facebook and elsewhere. And one particular campaign that we have, which he defines as a single issue campaign, is our campaign to eliminate the use of chickens in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish ritual called Kippuris, which means sacrifice or replacement, in other words, replacement of myself as the deserves to die by putting the chicken in my place, to die in my place. So the idea of, which is throughout human history, that you sacrifice somebody else to purge yourself or your society. So it's part of that tradition, which is anti-vivisection, right? It's all about putting illnesses in innocent, that is, unill animals, and making them sick as a way of cleansing human beings of our diseases. So these seemingly primitive rituals and ideas that lie behind these rituals are not just in the past or a relic of the past. They are very much alive and with us in our modern institutionalized uses, i.e. abuses of the members of other species. Well, anyway, just to be clear, it was from members, Jewish residents in the Bronx and Brooklyn in the early 90s, shortly after I started United Poultry Concerns in 1990, who alerted me and our organization to the practice of Kippuris, which I'd never even heard of before. And I have since learned that most people in the Jewish community never heard of it either. But it involves many thousands of chickens who are trucked in from factory farms in New Jersey or Delaware or whatever. They're from the meat industry, they're babies. They're trucked into Brooklyn and the Bronx and anywhere where these practitioners and their communities are located. And they sit out on the streets, on the sidewalks, in parking lots, stacked up in transport crates for days, unable to move their bodies because the birds are crammed in there without, of course, any food, water, or protection from the elements. So it's one of those cruelties that is very, if you're walking in Brooklyn and you're in Crown Heights, and here are these stacks, endless stacks of chickens, and they're just sitting there for days, waiting for the ritual itself to be conducted, where they're going to be grabbed and held most cruelly by their wings, which is very painful and breaks their wings and causes ligature damage and everything else. By this time, of course, they're starved and they're dehydrated, and they're going to grab them and they're going to swing them around their heads with their wings, by their wings, and offer this chant about how I transfer my sins into this chicken so that I may have a happy life in the year ahead, something like that. And then they're slaughtered in public. And it's one of these carnival situations where children and babies and they're just general mayhem, and the birds are crying, and it's just an example of what goes on behind the scenes that we seldom see, all the animals suffering and abuse, but here it is out on the street, in public display, the killing, the mishandling, the starvation, the treating of these birds as nothing, except as symbols of something that is wholly anthropocentric and all about ourselves, or in this particular case, about this particular community. So, in any case, last June, the New York City, or the New York State, or New York City Bars and Animal Law Committee held the first panel discussion ever about animal sacrifice, focusing on the Kaporis situation and the Kaporis campaign. And I was one of the speakers, but Gary Francione was also invited to speak on the constitutionality issues relating to animal sacrifice. But instead of giving his assigned, doing his assigned topic, he used the opportunity to lambaste the campaign and to denigrate it, and that's what he used his time to do. And I have to explain to you that one of the things that was shown by a Brooklyn lawyer up on the screen was all these chickens who have had their throats cut behind these tents, and these slaughterers and these men are just walking around. You see their feet just walking around casually and indifferently while these birds are writhing and screaming and crying on the sidewalk. And blood is everywhere. And so the question is, I use this as kind of emblematic of, as a way of getting into this question of so-called single issue campaigns. Gary, if I understand him correctly, seems to be saying this, that we should ignore these chickens and we should be standing out there telling people to go vegan. Well, okay, so basically how I interpret that is, if somebody, as they do, because people are walking by in Crown Heights and in other parts of Brooklyn and Bronx and Rockaway, New Jersey, and wherever, parts of Florida, and of course in Jerusalem, it's a huge issue, and saying, well, what is that, or what's going on here, and what are you doing about it? This is terrible. And should I just simply hand them a brochure that says, go vegan, and maybe has some recipes, or has a definition of vegan, which is basically, as I understand vegan in its most primal and encompassing meaning, encompasses all social justice issues related to both humans and other than humans, the entire earth, and all issues of compassion and rights, and all of those things, all of these things. To think about, well, okay, for instance, Gary, apparently, he invokes the plight of the homeless as an issue that we should be caring about. And so I'm thinking, well, analogously, you could say, well, if you gathered up all the homeless people in New York City or in San Francisco, for example, or Los Angeles, they would represent a very small number of people, even though it's a large number of people, but they would just be small compared to the big picture of all the people who are suffering maybe in Ethiopia or Bangladesh or many parts of Africa. And so what do? Do you just step over the homeless people and say, well, go vegan to passersby? Do you step over the chickens, metaphorically speaking, and just say, well, go vegan? Do you say, well, these chickens, yeah, they're being treated badly, but compared to what's happening and the number of chickens in factory farming, this is nothing. See, I believe that when you start saying that individuals don't count, that only the big picture counts, and that we should only be going after the most ultimate goal in all of our activism. That is kind of like there's no focus, and you're basically saying that these individuals don't count, but somehow everything counts, but the constituencies of the everything are not worth our time, or something like that. I mean, we can always look at a situation of injustice and involving a certain number of beings and say, well, but compared to what's happening over in this part of the world, this is just a small number, and why should we spend time on this group when it's all of human nature that we're trying to liberate from its prejudicial ideas, from its discriminatory behaviors, from its cruelties. What about, for example, trying to make sure that vegans in prisons are fed vegan, are able to eat vegan food? Isn't that a single issue? Is that not worth pursuing? And again, Andrea, who just gave her presentation about focusing on bullfighting, not ignoring other issues in Colombia, but explaining why they have chosen to focus particularly on bullfighting, because it is so symbolic, and because you have to have for example, a particular example of animal cruelty and animal abuse and inhumane treatment as a kind of test case, almost, as a way of you have to have something concrete to bring to the courts, or to bring to legislative bodies, or for that matter, to bring to the consciousness of mainstream society. I think, for example, of, well, the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. Okay, well, the civil rights movement, by the logic of the abolitionism that Gary Francione and people who follow him, by those standards, we could say, well, forget about what African Americans are going through in the United States, because it's much worse in South Africa. So we should just be, we shouldn't be focusing on just, you know, the injustices being perpetrated against and African Americans in the United States against Jim Crow laws and all of that. We should be reminding people that, well, yeah, these people are being treated terribly, but so are people in South Africa, and so are people in X, Y, and Z all over the planet. So, I mean, where does that get us? How do we start to help anybody? Even the civil rights movement in the 60s, which I was part of, broke down into specific campaigns. The Voting Rights Act, job, and trying to get laws that would end discrimination in the workplace. What about women's issues? We have anti-harassment campaigns in the workplace and everywhere else. We have equal pay campaigns, don't we? We have single-issue campaigns that break down into smaller campaigns within the larger campaign, because we have to focus on particular things that we're trying to accomplish. So within this whole human social justice effort that we are making globally and have been making historically, we don't just tell people to basically go vegan, as it were. You know, don't focus on any particular group of oppressed individuals, be they women or African Americans or Latinos, or for that matter, you know, whales or bulls or chickens. Just go vegan, or just be for universal emancipation. But I think you understand that there's a problem with the psychology of that, and you have to choose. Many people in our movement came to animal rights by virtue of having had an encounter with a particular animal. It was one animal, it was one suffering animal that opened their eyes to all animals, or maybe it was a gradual process, but you know, Alice Walker, as disappointing as she has been in her later life, still, one of the things she said that is so important in an essay she wrote a number of years ago called "Why Did the Balinese Chicken Cross the Road?" And she talks about watching a mother hen shepherd her baby chicks across the road, and she said, and I realized, she said it more eloquently than I'm paraphrasing here, but she said, and I realized watching her that she was like a sister of mine. And that, we, you know, basically we're kin. We're both mothers who care about our young and who are doing everything we can to make sure that our young are safely crossing the road. And she says something to the effect that, you know, now that I have seen this chicken, I am now, in effect, I have now seen all chickens. And I thought that's such an interesting take on the idea that, you know, once you've seen one chicken, you've seen them all, or once you've seen one, whatever it is, you know, now you've seen them all. You don't have to bother with anybody anymore again in your life, right? Once you've seen one redwood, you've seen it all. I think President Nixon said that, you know, like he didn't care about the redwoods, or it was him or somebody. It was one of the presidents, maybe it was Reagan, you know. Oh, once you've seen one redwood, you've seen them all, you know, fuck them all, you know. They don't matter, they don't matter, you know. But the positive way of looking at that is, at that idea is once you've seen one chicken, now you are responsible for all chickens. You don't have to know every single chicken now to be responsible for all of them, because you've met one and you realize that all the others are just as caring and sentient and have a life as valuable and as precious to that chicken as the one that you happen to meet and to see. As Alice Walker said, for now I really saw her. And having seen her, I cannot now unsee her. And by extension, I cannot now unsee all chickens. So for many people, coming to care about animals and animal rights and animal liberation and veganism has been the result of an encounter they had with a particular animal that led them to be able to extrapolate perceptually, conceptually, empathically to all animals, including animals they'll never meet, will never know. But they understand from having had this one very visceral, very powerful empathic insight into a particular animal. So I'm saying that, you know, to say that we shouldn't have single issue campaigns or, for example, United Poultry Concerns, our focus is on the plight and the light of chickens, turkeys, ducks, and other domesticated fowl, i.e. those birds who have the misfortune of being considered a food source for human beings. All of these birds came from a natural world. And sometimes when I hear these agribusiness people say, or even people who are not in agribusiness, or what's, you know, these animals, you know, there's nothing, they couldn't fend for themselves if we did set them free, so, you know, we should just keep on killing them because they can't be free, because we manipulated them to the extent that they can no longer live, you know, autonomously as flocks or herds or whatever. But we forget how many animals who we've domesticated through history who have become feral, who after a few generations shed all the negative characteristics we imposed upon them and debilitating characteristics, and did show an ability to resurrect their ability to live on their own without any human intervention, and, you know, much better off without our intervention. So one thing I'm saying is that if you think analogously, if you take the idea that we should only tell people to go vegan when we're talking about animal issues and animal abuses, if we analogize that to how a human social justice efforts are made, we immediately see that there's no such thing as just saying, well, we want universal social justice or nothing at all. We're not going to help this group or that group or that group or that group, because it's either all or nothing. So I don't see that as a practical, psychologically practical strategy for helping animals. I was very struck in the late 1980s when I was reading into deep ecology and the environmental philosophy, how, you know, again, there's this idea amongst not all environmentalists or all deep ecologists, but it's definitely pervasively part of the identity of these movements, that individuals don't count, that only the biosystem counts, that as long as we, you know, as long as the species survives, what difference does it make whether, you know, we cull a certain number of them, whether they be whales or, you know, clubbing baby seals or deer or whoever they are, you know? What individuals don't count, only the population as a whole counts. And again, each of us has to ask ourselves, well, do we think that way about our own lives and our own families? I mean, my mother doesn't matter because compared to the whole human race, she's just one, you know? And, or I, you know? How many are willing to die because they realize they're just an inconsequential contributor to overpopulation on the planet? I mean, think about that. When you start thinking that other animals, that their lives as individuals don't matter, well, then just ask yourself, if you have that same view with respect to anybody you truly love and care about, that their lives don't matter, or that you're not going to jump in and help a friend. Like, for that matter, we wouldn't even care about women who are raped, because we'd say, well, I mean, yeah, she was raped, but she wasn't killed. What about all the women who were murdered? Why should we just pay attention to women who were just raped? And why just women? So again, I hope you get the point that I'm making here. I would say that if we can't care about individuals, it's hard for me to think we can really care about the big picture in any meaningful way, let alone do anything about it. If the world that we live in is just like basically an empty shell, in which the constituents who make it up don't really count, but only the big picture counts. I don't know how, I don't understand that way of thinking, and I certainly don't share it. I did want to read you just a short statement by one of my colleagues. We have among many campaigns that we conduct all the time on a wide variety of issues affecting chickens and other domestic fowl, always with the goal of, and all our literature says, give a cluck, go vegan. Life can be beautiful, go vegan. We have a whole booklet. I gave it to Gary at the law panel, but he's decided that we're the enemy, so he doesn't even care. You know, he doesn't even care. And I swear he sat there when these chickens were writhing and crying, and he just, maybe he cared, but he didn't want to show it, but he acted like he didn't care. So that's how I feel. People were crying in the room, you know, and that seemed to make him mad. My friend, who's just the most powerful animal activist among others, but she's just got such chutzpah and such guts as well as such determination. She cares so much for animals. Her name is Rena Deitch, and she lives right there in Brooklyn and in Borough Park. And I mean, the ultra-Orthodox community that does this chicken swinging, slaughtering ritual, it's very patriarchal. And for years, by herself, Rena has gone into those tents with her camcorder and taken pictures of the slaughter and dared to speak out to the slaughterers, who consider her to be just a woman who should not even dare speak to them, let alone enter their domain, you know. But she's the kind of activist that I just admire so much. She has such courage, and she's just so she's got everything that an activist should have. She's got courage, she's got care, she's loving, takes no bull from anybody. I shouldn't say bull because I know that's not the right word. Sorry. Because I always think about, you know, when people talk about shooting like a bullseye, does that relate to ultimately like shooting at bull's eyes? I mean, is that where the idea of hitting the bullseye comes from? I mean, you start thinking about like where words originate when you suddenly realize it has something to do with like rule of thumb, you know? That was brought up yesterday in one of the presentations. How many people even know that you couldn't beat your wife with anything wider than the width of your thumb or something, for a man, the husband. And that, we use that term, the rule of thumb, without even thinking about where did that come from? You know, the rule of thumb. Or hitting the bullseye. Where does that come from? I have a feeling it's bad. But anyway, Rena Dage wrote. In fact, she wrote this, I think, to Gary in one of our many email exchanges. She said, while I completely agree that veganism should be promoted, and she's an avid promoter of veganism, I do not agree that so-called single-issue campaigns and promotion of veganism are mutually exclusive. In fact, many people, including myself, became vegan after becoming sensitized to the individual issues. Not all of us can relate to the concept of tens of billions of animals being slaughtered for their flesh or secretions. For many of us, it becomes a reality only when we see one animal suffering and hopefully, ultimately, being saved. It's harder to block out that one image of that one particular animal rather than maybe having a sense of them as just one big blob where we can't really identify with any of them because they're just like a sea of anonymities. So I think that an example of a justifiably criticized single issue approach is when, for example, you have, let's say there's a piece of legislation, let's say the Maryland legislature, because I used to go to, on behalf of particular bills, to the Maryland General Assembly. And one of the big issues in the 80s, still a same issue, I don't think it's ever been, any real laws have done much, address this issue very successfully of testing on animals for cosmetic testing on animals. The LD50 test and the phrase test, burning their eyes out with acids and things. But one of the ways that some of the lobbyists, the animal lobbyists, would invoke as a way to bond with a legislator or a legislative body was to reassure them that, hey, I'm only here to end cosmetic testing on animals. I'm not here, I'm not trying to make you stop hunting. I'm not trying to make you stop eating animals. I mean, when, the idea of trying to bond with people you're trying to change by reassuring them that you don't care about other animals or you don't want to help other animals. That's when single issue becomes detrimental, I believe. On particular issues without ever suggesting that you don't care about other animals or using other animals to bond with those whom you're trying to get a vote from or win over to your side. Another example is all of these humane societies, these local humane societies who constantly hold their fundraiser dinners for their dog and cat shelters and serve animal products. It's always chicken and fish and ribs. And so they're using one group of animals, suffering, abused animals, as bait to get people to come and help another group of animals. And they're eating animals, and they're like the only animals they care about are just these dogs and cats, and the rest they don't care about. That's where a single issue campaign is pernicious and does deserve opprobrium. But to have to focus on a particular group of animals, a particular set of abuses, in particular locations without suggesting, again, you have to learn how to keep your focus. But at the same time, with an implication that you're aware of the larger issue. You're not sacrificing the larger for the whole, for the particular. And you have to sort of help yourself to realize that, you know, the whole is incorporated in the particular, just as the particulars are what make up the whole. And I think of them as the interaction and interfusion of the unit and the ubiquity. And we have to realize that they're both part of each other. We are units, but we are part of the ubiquity, and the ubiquity itself is part of who we are. It's part of what we breathe. So, I suppose that this pretty much is what I have to introduce to you about single issue campaigns and the thoughts that I have had about single issue campaigns. And I should say to you that on our website, and our table is right outside, and all of our literature has our website address on it. On our homepage, on the left side, we have a set of topics going down the left side, and one of them is titled, Thinking Like a Chicken. I wrote an essay on a critique of environmentalism from the standpoint of a sort of like a factory farm hen that appeared in Animals and Women, Feminist Theoretical Explorations, edited by Carol Adams and Josephine Donovan back in 1995. And so I titled this one section of our website, Thinking Like a Chicken. So when you click that on, you'll see essays that I, and in some cases somebody else has written. But one of the essays, which you can just click on and read there, is Single Issue Campaigns and Abolition / Vegan Advocacy, What Would a Chicken Say? So you can read it, and other articles and essays that might interest you as well. So thank you for your attention.
Listening to you speak, Karen, it's really interesting with the words that you're using and the things that you're describing, and I feel like maybe you can speak to like kind of the mismatch. So I know we all know the Francione problem. As good as he is with law, he is a patriarchal bully that wants to silence conversations and keep infighting happening through things like using words. So whatever you feel, whether you agree with him or not, what he does is appropriate words. And arguing from your description of what you don't agree with, where single issue is bad, at the end where you said single issue is fighting for something at the expense of someone, fighting for someone at the expense of someone else, that would seem what you were describing with this vegan only issue, right? So that to me really seems like single issue if you only promote veganism at the expense of all else. Whereas having a campaign with one focus does not seem single issue. So I think it's necessary, and I think you talk to it, but to not let someone own the word single issue, because I think we can have a campaign that is focused and have an ideology that's holistic, all-encompassing and social justice oriented, which I think is what you described as the ideal. And I think when you described promoting veganism as being not single issue, I think you actually described this campaign of veganism to the exclusion of all others as actually what the problematic single issue actually is. You know?
Veganism is supposed to be the encompassing ethical stance, the ethical goal. That's what veganism is, in its broadest definition means. It means it's sort of the all-encompassing term that is being used not just to refer to the ethics of diet, but the ethics of social justice and compassionate living and behavior. So
I agree. I just feel like when you described what Francione is trying to do with it, that actually seems single issue. So
yeah.
I'm agreeing with you, and I'm like affirming your concept to that, and that actually seems the problem. Like maybe he's right, single issue is bad, but maybe that's what he's doing and erasing a holistic social justice view that might have campaigns that are focused.
Yeah, and by the way, the single issue campaign, that very term, I believe that's his term. I didn't, that's not my term. He coined that term. And so, again, trying to, open that up and look at it as well as the
I
term.
think he's appropriating terms to put a not negative connotation on things.
Yeah.
Because you have a focused campaign, not a single issue. You care about
Yeah, that's a good
justice,
distinction.
right?
A focused campaign, not a single issue campaign in the pejorative sense that, is being implemented.
But thanks for speaking up about it, because I know that might cause an problem with your leaders to come.
So I think that there's a connection between, what I think is a shallow critique of the single issue campaign, right? And like a cynical look on activism more generally. So Corey Wren runs a blog called The Academic Abolitionist Vegan. And she argues against single issue campaigns. And what she means by that is something particular, right? But she recently said, Ringling Brothers is no longer going to have elephant acts. And it turns out that the real reason isn't because we've been advocating for that in fighting circuses, but because there's this concern about tuberculosis and how it's really hard to control, and so it's like a PR thing from Ringling Brothers. And to me, that's the most cynical reading of the fact that Ringling Brothers isn't going to have elephant acts anymore. Now, it may be partially true that that's part of the motivation, right? But to say that, all of the activism and all the campaigning had no effect and it doesn't matter, to me, just deprives us of our power, And I've heard that about other things too. The real reason the civil rights happened, right, wasn't because people were fighting, it was because of all these other considerations, right? Or the real reason that we don't have slavery anymore, some other thing. And the idea that there's the one real reason, and we can identify it, and therefore we don't have power, and these campaigns don't mean anything, is so counterproductive. And to me, it's like, well, if that's true, then why the fuck do we do anything at all? If you really believe that. And I can't help but think that people like Corey Wren and Francione, right, are careerists in a sense of saying something is really, it's ultra left and it's so radical, but it's really kind of petty and meaningless, So I just really appreciate your focus on, well, these are the animals, right? They're actually here, they're actually suffering, I'm going to do something about it. And, if you want to have your party with your friends about how you don't like that stuff, well, that's fine, but I'm actually going to go do some work.
Thanks both of you for your thought. My question will be directed at Karen. First, I need to thank you so much for insisting on the fact that love and respect are not mutually exclusive. Not only do I think they are not mutually exclusive, but I think they must go together. As you well said, we must empathize with another individual being in order to eventually be able to connect with other ones that we have no idea and that we will never meet in our lives. So I really think that this point is important to stress. My question will be, in fact, just the kind of single issue campaign that I'm sincerely, profoundly opposed to are the single issue campaign targeting minorities. Minority practices. Like in Montreal, we have a lot of talk about dog meat, shark fin soup, as well as ritual slaughter, halal slaughter for halal meat. And when these things come up in the media, it's always a big mess. You end up commentaries like racist commentaries. It's just incredible. And the way in which our law is set up in Canada, our criminal code, it is made to target minority practices because in our law against animals, our law against cruelty to animals explicitly exclude the standard practices of the industry. So by definition, what would be mainstream in our society will be excluded from being considered as a cruel practices. And we can only focus on the minority practices. And this is a point that has been developed by Sudan Nelson and Wilkie Mika in your work. And I have a lot of trouble with single issue targeting practices from other peoples, which are not from our culture. Like there was a film against the ritual slaughter of dolphins happened in Japan in the Bay of Taiji, which was profoundly racist in so many ways. There's a fantastic academic paper on this if you're interested. But at the same time, there was this film Blackfish, which was also a single issue. But I did love this film for a lot of things. First, it targeted our own practices. It did not target the practices of some others, so it did not buy into this racist and ethnocentrist application of our compassion for animals. So I'm not sure what you think, because you actually targeted a practice that was from a minority, we can say. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I understand that the issue that you're raising about, identifying an animal cruelty that's being done by another, a minority group or, an ethnic minority. First of all, in the case of our Kaporis campaign and Chicken Kaporis campaign, well, chickens are those are the animals we speak for. That's why we exist. So if there's cruelty to chickens, we're going to be as many places as we can to try to speak for them. We've explained this to people who have challenged or questioned us about the anti-chicken Kaporis campaign. That we use this campaign, and Rena and I and other members of the Alliance, as a way to draw attention to people, to what chickens are going through all over the planet. Because when people say to us, oh, that's just terrible if they do that to those chickens. And what do we say, whether it's to the media or to somebody we're speaking to on the street? It is terrible, but what happened, but if you're not vegetarian, the chicken on your plate went through just as much, if not more misery. Okay, so we make sure that, again, we always put the situation in context, okay? Yeah, you're right. I mean, we have this sort of attitude in the United States, for example, that, well, and it's fostered by the animal, particularly the large animal welfare organizations. Oh, dog meat, Koreans eating dog meat is just, that's just the most terrible thing in the world. And you have campaigns to get the Koreans to stop eating dog meat by the very organizations and welfare organizations that are telling people it's perfectly okay to eat chickens and to eat cows. So they're reflecting the cultural biases at the same time, and they're also perpetuating them. And they're also, of course, engaging in the most egregious type of discrimination amongst these poor animals, because they're saying, oh, well, what dogs suffer is so much worse than what a chicken suffers. And a dog is more valuable than a chicken or a cow or a pig. So, yeah, I mean, we have to be always aware. Now, I believe that if we're all part of the human species. So I don't believe in this idea that, oh, hands off if it's human beings who have been oppressed. Don't touch them. I don't accept that at all. I don't accept oppression as an excuse to oppress some other group. Or the idea that somehow being a victim makes you virtuous or more virtuous than others, okay? You're part of the human race, you're engaging in a cruel practice, okay? You're fair game for our campaign. That's my attitude, okay? But we have similar campaigns here, right here, against and for issues right here amongst our own, society and culture. So we make that clear too. Again, if you're only targeting, what else do they target? Well, dog fur. How awful that horse meat would get into a hamburger. How awful that dog fur could actually end up on some of our fur coats. And yet some of the very groups that are saying there should be a campaign against making sure that no horse meat ends up in our hamburgers and no dog fur ends up in our fur trims and things, and yet they're totally silent about all the cows or the minks or all the animals who they're by implication saying, well, it's okay for those animals to be turned into fur coats and fur trims or to be in the hamburger, but it's just not okay for the dog to be in the hamburger. Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, that is unjust, that's unjust discrimination.
I just would like to add to your comment and what you just said, because we have a very similar thing going on in Brazil right now, which is the African Brazilian religions. They do a sacrifice involving chickens. And the animal rights activists are the people who are speaking against it. And
Who are or are not speaking?
No, they are speaking against it. The people who are in, they support the African Brazilian religions and the African Brazilians as well. They are saying that's a matter of racism, which is true. We are a racist society. It is true. Brazil, we have a problem with racism, but, and they say you should target the meat industry because they are killing cattle and they're killing chicken and all those other animals, and we're just doing our tradition. That's our religion. That's freedom of religion. That's a big debate right now, and I honestly believe that we need to speak for the animals, but it's a very complicated issue.
Well, if I may say something, okay, first of all, one thing about Kaporis, it happens once a year. It's circumscribed in time and place. And it's right out there on the street. It's done right in the public square. So it's something you can focus on. When you talk about going up against the meat industry, or the animal farming industry, you're talking about consumer behavior, basically. Because the meat industry only exists because human beings want to eat meat. Now, I mean, we can talk to forever about how we should be shutting down slaughterhouses and we should be making Purdue or Tyson or Smithfield or whoever stop doing what they're doing. But they're never going to stop doing what they're doing as long as people go to restaurants and supermarkets and buy animal products and want to eat those products. So it's a very big amorphous situation, the issue of industrial farming and human consumption of animals. It's much different, you know, bullfighting in a particular country, again, it's circumscribed. You can focus on it, you see? But when we're talking about like anti-vivisection, it's like an amorphous global enterprise. How do you get in there, you know? How do you get into there? How do you stop that? How do you reach into that world? And it's easier really to reach into the world in some ways of animal consumption than vivisection. Because here you can at least get people to change their habits. And it happens all the time. We do. Whereas with vivisection, most people aren't practicing vivisection except that they support slaughtering animals, which is vivisection. But they're not doing laboratory, you know, they're not doing in an institutionalized laboratory. So it's very difficult, and as Lauren Ornelas of Food Empowerment Project in California said when she was originally working against vivisection, she said one of the things that she liked about turning to the farmed animal, human consumption of animals issue was she felt she could never do anything about vivisection. But she could do something about eating animals for food are going through. We who eat them. We who eat their eggs and drink their milk. If we didn't do that, there wouldn't be any industry at all. So anyway, yeah, so there are different approaches one has to take to different types of abuses and different scales of abuse. And just, you know, I mean, we are always telling everybody, go vegan, okay? But there are ways of urging people to go vegan. There are ways of formulating the call to be vegan. And you don't always have to use the word vegan either. Not that we shy away from it, but there are other ways of talking. I like to talk about animal-free food. You know, I like the idea that you've been sort of implying the idea of like animal liberation and also using the word animal because we're talking about animals. It's so easy to talk about food all the time. And even as animal activists, the animals can be obliterated and the endless talk about the food. And that can even be a problem with vegan, because even the word vegan, however we are trying to make it an all-encompassing ethical ideal and goal and practice, it still has that, if you want to call it that, taint of being only about diet. So anyway. Yeah, I do too. So please feel free to speak, you know.
I have a question for Rebecca. I was hoping, I don't know much about him myself, but when you quoted him saying that, so is it my understanding that he imagines human or man as evolved from tiger, or that's just keeping their tigerness in check?
Well, I mean, it's a metaphor, right? We all have a tiger inside of us. But what's striking about that image to me is that the tiger has to be killed, right? So it's this weird moment where it's both an acknowledgement of the animal in the human, but that's what has to be killed in order to keep the human human, right? So it seems utterly inconsistent with his philosophy that all species deserve respect and, you know, we should have this interspecies.
It reminds me of Derrida's argument about man is wolf.
Is that a talk earlier today?
No, it's in the Sovereign and the Beast lecture series. The way the social accepts law is the understanding that law protects us from other humans who are wolf to man. So law keeps our wolfness in check.
And there's a feminist critique of that as well. I don't know that particular piece, but the notion that we have to keep, you know, certain men in check, and that's why we have to, as women, ally ourselves with other men to protect us, so that there becomes this gender security zone. Thank you.
I have some questions about the dream you mentioned, Gandhi, the goat dream, and this is in his autobiography. And how old was he? Very young when he had this?
High school.
Huh?
He was in high school.
Oh, he was in high school, okay. And how did he interpret the dream? Did he give an interpretation himself?
He did, not that I remember.
Okay, so you're saying, your interpretation is that this was terror on his part of the animal in him. But you know there are people who, Penelope Smith and Richard Sheldrake and other people who talk about communication with supposed paranormal communication with animals that they want to say it's really normal, happens all the time. Communicating with animals, and animals communicate with us all the time if you're sensitive to it, and telepathically and so on. And one of the ways Penelope Smith says that animals communicate is through dreams. They will appear in a dream. And I've had this myself. I've had communications with this. So from that point of view, I wonder if it couldn't be, since we're throwing out interpretations of the dream, why couldn't it have been an animal saying, look, this is what I am, this is the reality of what mediating is about, I'm bleeding.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and my analysis was not disagreeing with that. He really did eat the goat, right? Whereas the tiger is a metaphor, right? In Salt's writing, it's a metaphor. But he really did eat the goat, so the goat is a real being that in some way is mixed up, even though he says he got sick, it's mixed up with him somehow. And it's the mixing that seems to me to be the initiation of the terror, right? That somehow this goatness is mixing with the humanness, and he needs to be a vegetarian for the rest of his life, kind of to get away from that, to get away from that terror.
Well, what is the nature of the terror that you were describing? Was it guilt? The goat was crying inside of him for the suffering he had imposed on the goat?
Guilt both for that and for going against his entire tradition, his entire familial and religious tradition.
I thought you were saying saying that he was in terror of the animal that he was in some way an animal, and that was the terror.
I think that's the case with Saul.
Oh, it's not Gandhi.
I think Gandhi was reacting really to the animal that he had eaten,
Okay.
but that he was torn. He was obviously conflicted, right? At that point, he thinks he needs to eat meat in order to be a strong man and fight off British colonialism, right, on the one hand, but he can't stand the process of eating meat because then he has this suffering goat inside of him who's appearing in his dreams and
Rebuking him.
yeah.
And he seems to overcome that completely later on with his cow protection campaign, where he just goes all out. He says you have to identify with cows. Cows are a home of pity. We have to look at them and really see ourselves in them.
I actually cut that part out of the paper in order to make it shorter. Yes, I totally agree with you. He did do a lot of work on cow protection, but talk about a single issue campaign, right? I mean, cow protection is only about cows, and it doesn't even really protect them very well. So there's a problem there, right, with that. And I mean, I am not an expert in cow protection, so I can't pretend to know all the meanings of that in Indian society. But I understand that there are certain conservative ways of using cow protection as a kind of anti-Muslim discourse.
A year after his assassination, a year after Gandhi was assassinated, in the new constitution of India, there was a clause that forbade the killing of cows, largely as a result of what Gandhi did. And then India became vegetarian. Now I think 50% or 50, between 50 and 80% of India is still vegetarian, largely because of Gandhi's campaigning. So that's
I don't have facts on that, but yes, I know there are many vegetarians in India.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
Any questions? Comments?
I always have questions.
Oh, why don't you?
Are you sure no one else has questions? Come on.
Give you the last word.
I was a bit disappointed by the title of the autobiography of Henry Saul, like 7 Years Among the Savages, was it that? Yeah, it's also a profoundly
70 years. 70 years among
70
savages.
years, yeah.
Meaning
All these
the
talks about
British,
like
the
civilized and
the
savages
British
are.
population.
I think these are the kinds of words we shouldn't use either, because I mean it's highly like the colonialist connotations of these terms are pretty obvious, and also it serves to lower the animals, which are obviously seen as being savage and never civilized. But I just would like to follow up with the question I asked earlier to Karen, because I'm not sure that my question was completely clear, because my problem with the special issue targeting minority practices is actually that we tap into our racist tendencies in our society when we do that. These single issue campaigns work pretty well, precisely because we are in a racist society. So I think that, I know that it's not because they are oppressed that we should not be able to judge their behavior. That's not my point. My point is that we live in a society which is profoundly racist, and by doing these campaigns, we just feed this racism. We feed it in the sense that we encourage it first, and we feed it in the sense that we feed out of it in order to further the cause of the animals. That was mainly my problem with the single issue campaign.
Well, I'm not sure that I can add to what I said.
Yeah.
Maybe just like to follow up on that. I know with whaling, what I see as like the problem with racism in that discourse is that the focus is entirely on Japanese culture, right, and Japanese practices, and gosh darn it, why won't those Japanese, obey international law? But of course, if you actually study whaling, you know that New Zealand is right behind, like close runner-up, right, for the most whales slaughtered, right? And I've never read anything except from animal rights activists who are also anti-racist, right? That, well, hey, if we really care about whaling, we've got to talk about this too. And I do think there is a tendency to sort of demonize people of color, right, who do something that we're like, oh, we don't, kill whales here, which of course, I mean, we do in different ways, right? But the point being that on the one hand, we need to hold different cultures accountable, right, for animal exploitation, but on the other hand, we need to do it for the right reasons, right? Not because they're savages or demons or, because they don't respect international law, but hey, because actually slaughtering whales is problematic no matter who you are, right, no matter where you are. And so I definitely am sensitive to that dynamic. I think that is true. And I think that, if we went out on campus and we said, well, how do you feel, just talking to people, how do you feel about whaling? And, oh, that's terrible, right? But, oh, well, cows, that's another thing, Of course it's okay to eat a hamburger. So I do think that's one of our challenges, right, is holding people accountable for the right reasons and not the wrong ones.
That might be it. Thank you.
Beer time.
Oh, does she? Her work is so great. I would love to meet her. Is she as awesome as she seems?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Challenging.
I really watched that.
Yeah. She seems, from her work.
okay, my name is
To be honest,
Oh, actually, I will have, yeah, I will have, so I'm not going back.
yeah, exactly.
After tomorrow, when I give my talk.
And you'll have all your stuff.